What's up, what's up guys? Well, I would do an interesting little video today talking about yesterday, last night I did a video talking about some of the more controversial moments and controversial players in football, but today I thought I would do a video talking about some of the more kind of sad and horrible and I guess somewhat heartbreaking moments that we've seen in football over the years. So the first one I'm going to look at today is the Leicester City helicopter crash. So obviously, Leicester City's owner, former owner Ulvi Chai, always used to arrive at the stadium in his helicopter and would always, always leave. Obviously, the helicopter would always take off from the pitch at the end of the game. And this was obviously a regular thing. Now, unfortunately, on the 27th of October 2018, tragedy struck. So Leicester City were playing in the evening hit-off that day against West Ham at home. The game had finished, and most of the fans had left the stadium by that point. The Leicester City owner's helicopter landed on the pitch. The owner boarded the helicopter as he would usually do. The helicopter took off as normal. However, just moments after it took off, it started spinning out of control and it crashed down in an abandoned car park outside the stadium, or in an unused car park outside the stadium. Tragically, everyone on board the helicopter was killed on impact, died on impact. They were basically killed instantly, including the Leicester City owner Vijay Srivadana Prava. Now obviously this was a horrendous incident that happened, but you gotta you gotta say that the pilot's actions that night were truly heroic. The fact that he managed to bring down the helicopter away from where there was loads and loads of fans. And if he'd have brought that helicopter down where in an area where there was loads and loads of fans, that situation would have been a whole lot worse. There would have been a much larger number of casualties than there actually were, and potentially a much larger number of fatalities than there were. The only fatalities that there were, obviously, were all the people that were on board the helicopter. Thankfully, nobody else was killed. No, there was no fans who were killed or anything like that. And that was down to the heroic actions of the pilot, who managed to bring the helicopter down in an unused car park. I mean, obviously that was a horrendous event, and I know that it was an event that kind of hugely affected Leicester City, football club as a whole. I was very shocked, when I heard about this, because I remember seeing this on the news, and I was like, Jesus, how's that happened? And my immediate thoughts turned to everyone at Leicester City Football Club, and I was like, Jesus, I can't imagine how devastated everyone associated with Leicester City is right now. It's unbelievable. So moving on, we have the death of Emiliano Sala. Now, Emiliano Sala was a player who had just signed for Cardiff City. He completed his medical. He flew back. He was invited to the Cardiff game against Newcastle on the 19th of Jan, but he chose to fly back to Nantes so that he could say goodbye to all of his teammates, and obviously pick up all of his belongings. And obviously on the 21st of January, he boarded his flight to Cardiff City ahead of his first training session with the team the following day. Tragically, he never made it to Cardiff. Obviously, they lost contact with the plane over the Channel River and the Channel, over the English Channel, and obviously the plane had crashed into the English Channel, and obviously after an extensive search, the plane was found, and Emiliano Sala's body was actually found in the wreckage of the plane. Now, although Emiliano Sala's body was found, the body of the pilot, David Ibbotson, was never actually found. I mean, obviously, you're wondering who the name of the pilot for the Leicester City helicopter crash. His name was Eric Swapper. Obviously, just so that you know. I mean, obviously, I mean, that was like horrendous. Obviously, he was just about to join his new team, and bang, that happens. I still don't think he should have been. They should have had him on that plane. I mean, that even he said the plane. If you listen to the final message that he sent before the plane went down, the message translates to him basically saying that the plane feels like it's about to fall apart at any moment. You know, I mean, I can't imagine how scared like he must have been. Obviously, that plane obviously wasn't in a great condition. Probably shouldn't have even been flying that plane that night. To be honest, that's what I'm gonna say. So moving on, we have not a particularly horrifying moment, but there's a couple of sad moments. We took a look at some manager retirements. So the first one, well, the manager's departing or retiring. So the first one, Sir Alex Ferguson. Now, but obviously, Sir Alex Ferguson's retirement was a sad day for Manchester United. I mean, none of the United fans could have predicted how bad things were going to get after Sir Alex Ferguson retired. I don't think anybody could have predicted that things were going to be as bad as they were, but, flipping it, things are bad right now for Leicester City and for everyone associated with the team at this point. I mean, it is unbelievable. Truly, truly unbelievable. What happened, and it is sad that happened. It is. I've always been, very, very, very sad for Manchester United. Obviously, I was very sad after Ferguson retired. But I think with Sir Alex Ferguson, I mean, he wasn't right. He was the greatest manager we've ever had, and there will never be another manager who will be able to achieve the same success that he was able to achieve with Manchester United. It's like Arsenal. I don't think there is ever going to be a manager who is going to achieve the same success that Arsene Wenger achieved with them in the early to mid 2000s. I mean, again, Arsene Wenger probably one of the best managers that Arsenal have had within the last 20 odd years. I don't think there's been anyone better than Arsene Wenger. I think Arsenal have only actually had two permanent full-time managers since he left. Obviously, those being Unai Emery and Mikel Arteta. I feel like Mikel Arteta has been a little bit more successful than Unai Emery was. Obviously, he's got Arsenal to a second place finish 3 seasons in a row, which isn't bad. He also got Arsenal to a Champions League semi-final. And that was something that Unai Emery couldn't do. That was something that Arsene Wenger didn't do. Obviously, it was obviously a tough day watching, the last day of the season, Arsene Wenger's final game with Arsenal. Um, yeah, that was a sad moment in football, I guess you'd say. So as I already talked about some sad moments, haven't we? Leicester City's plane crash, Emiliano Sala's, a tragic death. The retirement and the departures of some of the best managers in English football. So moving on, we have the tragic death of a young player. Now this is Dylan Tombidis. Now Dylan Tombidis was a player that I think if it hadn't been for the fact that he passed away at such a young age, I think he would have gone on to have a very successful career, whether that was with West Ham or another team. So obviously Dylan Tombidis was diagnosed with testicular cancer in 2011 and tragically passed away 3 years later. He lost his battle with cancer 3 years later on the 18th of April 2014 at the age of just 20 years old. Now, this is obviously really, really sad. A player that lost their life at such a young age. A player that had, a huge career ahead of them. ahead of him, and he had his career tragically cut short. He had that huge career, taken away from him, by this, you know, this start obviously by obviously cancer and everything. You know, I feel like cancer robbed us of a player that could have been, potentially one of the best players. Dylan Tombides was a very talented player. That goes without saying. And when I think about how great it saddens me to think about how great he could have been as he got older, and how much success he could have achieved, whether that was with West Ham United or with another team. I think he would have gone on to have achieved a lot of success. I think as time went on, I think he would have caught the eye of a lot of big teams. I think a lot of big teams would have wanted to, would have been wanting to sign him. And it's just heartbreaking that he had his career cut short. Like his life was tragically cut short by this, by this unexpected cancer diagnosis. And the fact that he was dying, I mean, obviously testicular cancer, and there have been, quite a few players that have been diagnosed with that. The two that come to my mind are Stilian Petrov, who played for Aston Villa, and Newcastle United legend Jonas Gutierrez. I remember he was diagnosed with testicular cancer as well. But for Dylan, I always feel like really sorry for his family, and I feel sorry for him because he was such a young player and he had such huge potential. I mean, never got to see what he would, what he would have achieved because he was taken, at such a young age by testicular. Obviously, unfortunately, lost that battle. It was quite a brave battle with testicular cancer at 20 years old. So God bless him. So next up is the tragic passing of Bradley Lowry. Now, Bradley Lowry was, I mean, he was someone that sort of touched the lives of a lot of people he met. I think his battle, like his story and like his battle with cancer, I think, had an impact on a lot of people. The friendship that he had with Jermaine Defoe was incredibly special. I remember the day, I think it was the day before Bradley passed away. Jermaine Defoe actually broke down in his press conference with Bournemouth, as obviously he just signed for Bournemouth at the time, and he was in the press conference with them, and he broke down because I think if I remember correctly, Bradley's condition had taken Bradley had taken a turn for the worse. His condition had obviously deteriorated, and that's what caused him to break down. And I think that was, if I remember correctly, the day before Bradley actually passed away. I remember, and I said this in the video I did after the talking about the playoffs final the other day. I was talking about how I was well, last week actually I was talking about how impressed I was that Sunderland had reached the playoff final, and I said that I thought Bradley Lowry would be very, very proud if he was here now. I think I said he'd be absolutely delighted and over the moon, knowing that Sunderland are back in the Premier League. As right as he never got to, unfortunately, and it's sad that he never got to see that. Obviously, he saw them relegated. He saw them get relegated, but sadly, he never got to see Sunderland be promoted back to the Premier League. But I'm sure if he'd still been here now, he'd have been very delighted. He'd been over the moon, delighted at knowing that Sunderland were a Premier League team once again. So another obviously horrible moment is the horrific moment in which Fabrice Muamba collapsed during a match. So Tottenham playing Bolton in a FA Cup quarter final, and an FA Cup. It was either the fifth round or the quarter finals. It was Tottenham Bolton at White Hart Lane. Fabrice Muamba was playing for Bolton at the time, and he just collapsed on the pitch. Like there was no player, no one really around him. He just collapsed, and he went into he basically suffered a cardiac arrest. Now, thankfully for him, there was an off-duty cardiologist. He was there that night, like an off-duty doctor, and he asked the the stewards to let him onto the pitch because he might be able to help out, and they let him onto the pitch. And then obviously when they got him into the ambulance, he said to them, get us to the veterinary chest hospital, because they had obviously doctors and nurses there waiting on standby. Um, it's crazy to think that Fabrice Mwamba actually survived that. It's miraculous that he did. This was a horrifying moment, but at least it had a happy ending. At least it wasn't one of those situations where it was we're talking about a player that collapsed and obviously tragically died on the pitch. And obviously collapsed on the pitch and later died. Which has happened with so many players, and I'll mention one of those players in a moment. But at least with Fabrice Mwamba, he was in cardiac arrest for over an hour. He was in cardiac arrest for 72 minutes. And I still can't believe he actually survived that. I still can't believe that he lived to tell the tale, but I'm glad that he did. I'm glad that I thought obviously he was never, he wasn't able to return to football. He's not being able to retire from football after that, but at least he survived. At least he lived to tell the tale. I imagine he probably doesn't remember too much about that. What happened that day, if anything. Imagine being out being in cardiac arrest for 72 minutes. It's like that. The fact that he survived that is miraculous. It also kind of reminds me at the moment that Christian Eriksen collapsed on the pitch with Denmark. Playing against Finland at the Euros. That was a truly horrible moment. Like, he just went down. Obviously, you've seen how worried the fans were. You know, it's like when Fabrice Muhammad collapsed again, the fans were very worried, they were distraught. I seen on the news that the game had been abandoned as there'd been some kind of serious injury. But I didn't exactly know what had actually happened. I didn't realise the situation was as serious as what it was. Obviously, Fabrice Muhammad had collapsed on the pitch. Christian Eriksen, at least with Christian Eriksen, he was able to return to football after that happened. He's been able to carry on playing football after that cardiac arrest, um, which is good. And it's like Tom Lott here as well. He's suffered two cardiac arrests on the pitch, one in the playoff final for Luton, and then one during the Premier League game last season against Bournemouth. I think they were all playing at Bournemouth in that game, and he collapsed on the pitch. Imagine that, collapsing twice on the pitch in the space of, in the space of what, 6 months. It's crazy. Obviously, as I said, some players have collapsed on the pitch and have later died. There's been a number of players that have done that. Obviously, Antonio Puerta, Miklos Feher, he collapsed on the pitch. It's all, it was very, very sad. Mark Vivian Foe, obviously was playing I remember, obviously 2003. Mark Vivian Foe was playing in the Federations Cup semi-final game for Cameroon against Colombia. And 72 minutes into the game, he collapsed. And unfortunately, he later died, and his death was later found as being due to hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. So yeah, there have been a lot of incidents where players have collapsed on the pitch, and it is sad, obviously, when that happens, it was like that young player, Abdul Haknour, a very young, still a young player, had a whole result ahead of him, and then bang, collapsed on the pitch and was left with permanent brain damage and has never been able to return to football. It just goes to show how life can change in an instant. Even the fittest players can just collapse, all of a sudden. There have been some truly. You talk about like footballing disasters, like the Munich disaster, that was incredibly tragic. Same with Hillsborough disaster as well. Both tragedies that will never ever be forgotten. There's 96 Liverpool fans, 97 Liverpool fans who died will never be forgotten. Those who died in the Munich plane crash will never be forgotten. It's just crazy, like, to think about some of the, sad and, tragic moments in football. And as as I mentioned with Dylan Tombidis, young player, you know, very young talented player, ends up being, diagnosed with testicular cancer and ends up, losing his battle 3 years later. And the fact that he was only 20 years old as well, like, he still had a lot of his, he still had so many years ahead of him. Like, this is the saddest thing about Dylan Tombidis is he was so young and he had such a big. I think he would have had a huge career ahead of had it not been for the fact that had it not been for that cancer diagnosis. It just goes to show how these things can kind of come out of nowhere. Like, 1 minute you're loving life, living your life to the full, and the next minute you're being told that you've got testicular, you've got cancer, and it's like huge. And I do feel for his family. And it's crazy to think that, it's sad to think that we never really got to see just how much Dylan Tombidis would have achieved. And as I said, I think he would have achieved a hell of a lot in his career had he not passed away at such a young age. I know I've always said I thought it was really, really sad that Dylan Tombidis was taken at just 20 years old. No one ever deserves to lose their life, lose their life to cancer, especially at such a young age, especially when they've got so many years of their life ahead of them, which Dylan Tombidis did. Like, he has so many years of his life still ahead of him. He has such a huge career ahead of him. And he had that taken away from him. He never got to reach the heights of his career. He never got to achieve, the success that he could have achieved. Whether that was with West Ham United or with another team. It's just extremely, extremely sad. And there have been a few players that have died at, a relatively young age. I wouldn't say that footballers dying at a young age is a common thing. I would say that's more, that it's more of a common thing in wrestling rather than football. I don't think. Some footballers do die at a young age, but I don't think that's a regularly common, relatively common thing. If I had to think of another heartbreaking moment, the passing of, the death of Justin Edinburgh. I did feel sorry for Leighton Orient because obviously they just, celebrated coming up to, being promoted to League Two. Justin Edinburgh obviously travelled out to Madrid to watch his former team Tottenham play Liverpool in the Champions League final. He came back just a couple of days after he came back from the final. He collapsed and he suffered a cardiac arrest and he died 5 days later. And I think Justin Edinburgh was only about 49 when he died, so he wasn't that old. And I remember how, like, devastated, the Leighton Orient fans were, and I think, and understand them being devastated. They just lost one of their biggest, they just lost, their great manager. Justin Edinburgh was one of the best managers that Leighton Orient have ever had. And there'll never be another manager quite like Justin Edinburgh. God bless him. What a manager he was, and the success that he achieved with Leighton Orient. I often wonder what he would have done, what like the success that he would have achieved with Leighton Orient the following season. I actually think, like, there's no knowing the amount of success that he could have achieved with Leighton Orient. But sadly, he was taken from the way. He was taken far too soon at 49 years old. Suffered a major cardiac arrest. That is very, very sad. Um, yeah, there have been a lot of sad moments Just horrible moments, in terms of horrible injuries we've seen on the pitch, career-ending injuries. We've seen players nearly dying on the pitch, from serious injuries. You know, I always think it's sad. What the sad, I always get sad when a player has to retire because of injury. You know, it's always sad when that happens. And sadly, it's just happened with so many players. Like so many players have had to retire because of injury. It's sad to think about, really, but that is the harsh realities of football. It's things like that do happen. Players sometimes do have to retire because of injury. Sadly, it's not something that is strictly unheard of in football. It does happen. I mean, yeah, it's just madness. I was thinking about that. I was thinking about the Germany and France game that was being played when the bombings happened in France. You actually hear the bomb go off during the match. Like Jesus, that's scary, man. Imagine hearing that bomb going off and you're in the stadium and you hear that boom, a bomb going off. And what the heck was that? And I think that match was even on live TV, if I remember. Yeah, maybe wrong on that. Um, obviously, what happened with Liverpool recently, the Liverpool parade on Monday was obviously very, very sad. And obviously, heartbreaking and a heartbreaking thing to have happened. And it's sad that things like that can happen. You know, when people are just trying to celebrate and have fun and have a good time, and it turns into one of the most horrifying moments of your life. It's just unbelievable. It's sad to me to think. It's sad to think about some of the truly sad moments we've seen in football. Um, and I'm sure there'll be many more sad moments as the years go on. But yeah, I mean, those were just some of the saddest moments that I can think of. The saddest one for me was definitely Dylan Tombides passing away at such a young age. I mean, the Leicester City plane when the helicopter crash was just as devastating as was the Emiliano Sala plane crash. You know, I mean, yeah, it's just horrible. Um, yeah, I hope you enjoyed this video anyway. Well, I do a little video on that. I hope you have an awesome day. Catch you all later. Bye bye.